Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. In the United States today, the debate over war powers is no longer just a constitutional question, buried in legal theory or congressional procedure. It has become a reflection of something much deeper, the transformation of American governance under conditions of political polarization, institutional fatigue, and executive expansion. What used to be a carefully balanced tension between Congress and the presidency has increasingly tilted toward the executive branch. But not in a clean or uncontested way. Instead, it has evolved into a highly partisan battleground, where questions of war and peace are filtered through political identity rather than institutional principle. At the center of this shift is a long-standing constitutional ambiguity. The U.S. Constitution assigns the power to declare war to Congress, while designating the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In theory, this division was meant to ensure that no single individual could unilaterally commit the nation to prolonged military conflict. In practice, however, modern warfare, rapid crisis response, intelligence operations, and global military presence have gradually expanded presidential authority far beyond what the framers of the Constitution could have anticipated. Over time, presidents of both parties have relied on authorizations for the use of military force, emergency declarations, and broad interpretations of commander-in-chief powers to conduct military operations without formal declarations of war. What is different in the current era is not simply the expansion of executive authority, but the way in which this expansion has become normalized and politically sorted. Military action is no longer evaluated primarily on its constitutional grounding or strategic necessity. Instead, it is increasingly interpreted through the lens of partisan alignment. When a president of one party initiates or escalates military action, members of the opposing party are more likely to challenge its legality or morality, while members of the president's own party are more likely to defend it or remain silent. This pattern has gradually eroded the possibility of a unified institutional stance on the use of force. In recent congressional debates over restrictions on presidential war powers, this polarization becomes particularly visible. Efforts to reassert congressional authority, such as proposals requiring explicit authorization before military action against Iran or other adversaries, often fail not because lawmakers disagree on the abstract principle of legislative oversight, but because they are filtered through immediate political calculations. The same proposal that might be framed as a necessary safeguard against executive overreach in one political context becomes, in another, a perceived constraint on national security or a political attack on the sitting president. As a result, votes on war powers increasingly follow party lines rather than cross-party constitutional coalitions. This dynamic creates a paradox. On paper, Congress retains significant authority over war-making decisions. It controls funding, it can pass authorization statutes, and it has investigative and oversight powers. Yet, in practice, its ability to act as a unified institutional check has weakened. The fragmentation of political consensus means that even when members of Congress are individually concerned about executive military action, collective action becomes difficult. The institutional incentive structure favors partisan positioning over institutional assertion. Meanwhile, the presidency has not only accumulated operational control over military action, but also symbolic control over its interpretation. The executive branch sets the narrative framing of conflicts in real time, whether an action is described as deterrence, retaliation, self-defense, counterterrorism, or escalation. These definitions matter because they shape how quickly action is taken, how it is legally justified, and how it is publicly perceived. Once military action is initiated, it becomes significantly harder for Congress to reverse or constrain it without appearing to undermine national security or weaken ongoing operations. This is where the modern media environment amplifies institutional imbalance. The speed of information flow, combined with partisan media ecosystems, means that military events are immediately absorbed into political storytelling. Within hours of an operation or escalation, competing narratives emerge, one framing the action as necessary defense of national interests, another framing it as reckless escalation or unconstitutional overreach. These narratives harden quickly and become part of the broader political identity structure, making later institutional correction or bipartisan reflection more difficult. The result is not simply stronger presidents, but more fragmented governance. Executive authority expands in practice but without stable bipartisan legitimacy. Each expansion of presidential war power is simultaneously defended and contested, depending on political affiliation. This creates a cycle in which future presidents inherit both the precedents of expanded authority and the precedent of intensified opposition to that authority. Over time, the system does not converge toward equilibrium. It oscillates between expansion and resistance, with increasing intensity. This pattern is particularly visible in debates over authorization for military force in regions, such as the Middle East. In recent discussions involving potential conflict escalation with Iran, for example, congressional divisions are not merely about strategy. They reflect deeper disagreements about the role of the United States in the world, the legitimacy of preemptive force, and the credibility of executive intelligence assessments. Yet these substantive issues are often overshadowed by immediate partisan framing, whether supporting or opposing military authority aligns with or contradicts opposition to the current administration. At the same time, presidents are incentivized to act decisively and unilaterally in moments of perceived crisis. Modern threats are often framed as time-sensitive: missile launches, proxy attacks, maritime disruptions, cyber incidents, or intelligence warnings. In such environments, waiting for congressional authorization is frequently portrayed as impractical or dangerous. This reinforces a structural tendency toward executive action first, legislative review later. Even when Congress expresses concern after the fact, the operational reality has already shifted. This does not mean Congress is irrelevant. On the contrary, it retains significant leverage, particularly through funding and political legitimacy. However, its influence is increasingly reactive rather than proactive. It responds to executive actions rather than shaping them in advance. And because responses are filtered through partisan divisions, they often lack the coherence necessary to fundamentally redirect policy. Another important dimension of this shift is the changing nature of accountability. In earlier periods of American history, major military engagements, such as Vietnam or Iraq, eventually generated broad bipartisan reassessments of executive decision-making. While these conflicts were deeply controversial, they also produced institutional reflection that transcended immediate partisan divides. Today, however, even long-term military engagements are more likely to be interpreted through competing partisan narratives that persist long after the events themselves. This makes collective learning more difficult and increases the likelihood of repeating similar structural patterns under different administrations. The judiciary, which occasionally plays a role in checking executive authority, has also been relatively restrained in directly adjudicating war powers disputes. Courts often treat these issues as political questions, deferring to the elected branches. This further reinforces the centrality of the executive-legislative dynamic, without introducing a strong external constraint capable of decisively resolving conflicts over authority. What emerges from all of this is not a constitutional collapse, but a gradual reconfiguration of balance under pressure. The American system is still functioning, but its internal coordination mechanisms are under strain. War powers are neither fully centralized nor effectively shared. Instead, they exist in a contested space where authority is exercised by the executive, contested by the legislature, and interpreted through partisan lenses by the public. This condition creates strategic uncertainty as well. Allies and adversaries alike must interpret U.S. intentions through a system where policy continuity is not guaranteed across administrations, and where even within a single administration, signaling may be rapidly adjusted in response to political or security developments. For adversaries, this can create both deterrent ambiguity and opportunity for exploitation. For allies, it complicates long-term planning and increases reliance on executive-level assurances, rather than institutional predictability. At the domestic level, the politicization of war powers also feeds back into broader institutional trust. When military decisions are perceived as partisan rather than national, public confidence in both Congress and the presidency can erode. Supporters of one party may view congressional opposition to military action as obstructionist, while supporters of the other party may view executive action as authoritarian. Over time, this mutual suspicion reduces the space for shared institutional legitimacy. It is important to emphasize that none of this implies that the United States has abandoned constitutional governance or entered a state of systemic failure. Rather, it reflects a system adapting, sometimes awkwardly to new conditions, permanent global military presence, rapid crisis cycles, high political polarization, and instantaneous media interpretation. The constitutional framework remains intact, but its practical operation has become more fluid, contested, and politically charged. In this sense, the debate over war powers is not just about war. It is about the nature of American governance itself, whether institutions can still function as shared frameworks of decision-making, or whether they are becoming extensions of partisan competition. The answer is not yet fully determined, but the trajectory suggests increasing difficulty in separating constitutional authority from political identity. What is clear, however, is that the traditional model of war powers as a stable balance between Congress and the president is no longer an accurate description of reality. Instead, it has become a dynamic system in which authority is continuously negotiated, contested, and reframed under the pressure of political polarization. And in that environment, the question is not simply who has the legal right to authorize war, but whether any institution can still generate a broadly accepted consensus on when and how force should be used. That unresolved tension is now one of the defining features of American political life. Thanks for watching.